It's my privilege to introduce to you Reverend Kathy Abbott, our district superintendent. 여기까지가 제가 formal introduction이고요. 우리 감리사님은 사실 저희 교회 식구나 다름없습니다. She is McLean residence. Within 5 minutes driving away. 예, 그렇죠. 그래서 자주 저희 교회 방문해 주시는데 오늘 특별히 말씀 전해 주시는데 여러분들의 큰 은혜가 되길 원하고요. 또한 우리 감리사님의 better half. 언니, where are you? Would you raise your hand so that we can welcome you? 감사합니다. 우리 감리사님 나오셔서 나오미와 룻의 우리 말씀을 전해주실 때 여러분 마음은 활짝 여시고 큰 은혜 받는 시간 되길 원합니다. 뜨거운 박수로 우리 감리사님 맞아주시면 감사하겠습니다.
Good afternoon. Will you pray with me and for me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. And I also want to acknowledge a debt of gratitude to Peggy Parker, who is the artist whose woodblock images you will see on the screen. My younger son, Tim, delights me with his devotion to his firstborn, Lily. There's just something about babies that fills our hearts with joy and gives us hope for the future. Now, Tim's wife, Alya, moved to the United States when she was about 10 from Russia. Her grandparents and her elderly aunts communicate primarily in Russian. They also speak an amazing number of other languages like French, but not so much English. And while her parents function very well at work in English, they prefer when they're with their friends to express themselves in Russian. And so Tim and Alya have decided to raise Lily to speak both Russian and English.
Это зебра. Да. Это тигр. Это змея.
And if you can't hear him, Tim is trying to speak in Russian. When I asked him why they were teaching Lily Russian, he said, it's all about relationships. They want Lily to be able to communicate with her grandparents and other relatives in the language in which they are most comfortable expressing themselves. You know, for immigrant families, what to keep and what to shed from their culture of origin is an important source of identity and discernment. Now, in today's world, there are 258 million people who live in a country where they were not born. 19% of this total live right here in the United States. In North America, of our population growth in the last 15 years, 42% came from immigration. Germany has taken in more than 1 million immigrants, largely since 2015, many fleeing war and chaos in other parts of the world, including Syria. When Ernie and I visited South Africa, we were astonished to discover that the South African people of African origin resented Africans from other countries coming and, in their view, taking our jobs. So around the world, we face these issues of immigration. So I wonder, in this group, how many people here came from another country? How many of your parents came here from another country? Yes, you know this story well. So today's biblical story is a story of immigration. Naomi and her husband leave their home in Bethlehem because there's a famine in the land. Now they move to Moab. Ironic, because Bethlehem means house of bread. It was a place that was renowned for its grain. Most Israelites considered Moab to be a place of death and destruction. But When you're in the middle of a famine, you do what you have to do. In Moab, Naomi's husband died. Then her 2 sons married 2 local girls, Orpah and Ruth, and life went on. Naomi's life was hard. First one son died, and then the other, and suddenly Naomi has nobody but her daughters-in-law. She urges them to stay in Moab and make a new life for themselves in their homeland. Go back, each of you, to your mother's house, she tells them. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you, in the house of your husband. She's imagining they will remarry there in Moab. Then she kissed them. She wept aloud. Now Naomi was a stranger in a strange land, and in ancient Israel, names have meaning. Naomi means sweet. But whatever sweetness there was in Naomi's life had shriveled up and died. Naomi decides to go home, and her daughters-in-law offer to go with her, but she discourages them. Turn back, my daughters, go your way. No, my daughters, it has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me. Sweet Naomi has become bitter. Bitter people often choose isolation. They choose a lonely path. Naomi plans to return home alone to Bethlehem, where the famine, the physical famine, has ended. But the spiritual and emotional famine in Naomi's life, the one that took her husband and her 2 kids, has made bitterness her only companion. This bitterness of heart and spirit now causes Naomi to push away the only family that she has, Orpah and Ruth. Naomi feels cut off from her family because there are no children, and from her homeland far away. At such a time as this, some word must be spoken. Ruth knew this. She speaks a powerful word to Naomi. Do not press me to leave you or turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people. Your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you. So Ruth decides to leave her homeland and accompany Naomi back to Bethlehem. For Ruth, Naomi is family, and she will leave all that she knows and everyone that she knows, just so Naomi will not be alone. Through her decision to immigrate, Ruth creates a future for Naomi. Ruth reminds Naomi of her love. What she's saying, in essence, is, Naomi, your people are my people. Your God is my God. Therefore, where you go, I will go. I will be there for you. You are not alone. Naomi thanks her daughters-in-law for their kindness. Now, this word that's translated as kindness in English, in Hebrew, is hesed. And it's better translated as fierce covenant loyalty. Sort of think of a positive version of the Tiger Mom. Now, this word describes the nature of God. It describes moments of grace, undeserved love, and mercy, but with an edge to it. There's a ferocity to it. Naomi is saying that in the kindness of Ruth and Orpah, she has experienced the love of God. Even though Ruth and Orpah are from another culture and were raised in a different way, Naomi, who's a foreigner, experienced the love of God through them. So Ruth and Naomi set off for Bethlehem together. And it is here that we see the depth of sadness that has enveloped Naomi. She enters Bethlehem. She runs into some people she knows at the gate, and they say, "Are you Naomi?" And she said to them, "Call me no longer Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" Naomi is in such deep despair. She tells her friends to call her Mara, which means bitterness. This once sweet woman has taken on a new identity, a woman disappointed by life and by her God. And this is the story of many immigrants. They travel to a new land, fleeing persecution or famine or war, or simply seeking a better life. But that new land isn't always the promised land, is it? I think you know the story. Bitterness can come and inhabit our hearts when life disappoints us. Now, I've been blessed in my ministry in many ways by the Korean American Church. Bishop Cho was my first boss after seminary, and after 7 short years in the ministry, he did the rather unconventional thing of making me a district superintendent. You know, I wouldn't be here preaching today if it weren't for Bishop Cho's love and care. I have learned so much from him. Who here knows what I mean? Yeah. And then Kiak reached out to me and invited me to pray with her, and I have learned so much from her deep spiritual wisdom. She bears a particular love for this book of the Bible. Who here knows what I mean about Kiak? Bishop Cho took a number of us in the Virginia conference on spiritual pilgrimages to Korea because he wanted to share what the Korean church can offer to us here in America. And many other Korean Americans have taught me about the unique blessings and challenges that the Korean American churches face today. And as I have listened, I have learned that churches like KUMC face a huge generational challenge. The next generation is more deeply influenced by American culture than the first generation of immigrants. How can we be in Christian community together when the culture of one generation is different from the next? What is essential in Christian community and what can be left behind as we move from generation to generation seeking to pass on the faith? So I wonder, what lessons might we learn from the story of Ruth and Naomi? Let's see what happens when Ruth becomes the immigrant and Naomi the guide. So Naomi returned together with Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, who came back with her from the country of Moab. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Now, in the Bible, this is called foreshadowing. The Lord is going to use Ruth's adaptation to the culture of Israel to bring a harvest into both Naomi and Ruth's lives. You see, both Ruth and Naomi are widows. They have no way to sustain themselves. Ruth is a stranger, and she doesn't know the Israelite culture or ways. So Naomi instructs Ruth on how things work. She sends Ruth to ask permission of the landowner Boaz to glean the grain that falls to the ground during the harvest. Now, this is one way that the Israelite community provided for the widows and orphans. They left grain at the edges of the fields that could be gleaned by people who were poor. Another way the community provided for widows was that the closest male relative could marry the widow and purchase or redeem the property owned by the dead son. Thus, a redeemer is someone who buys back something or someone who frees someone from captivity or oppression. When Naomi sent Ruth to Boaz the landowner, she knew he was a potential redeemer. Boaz was in the family's line, and he could redeem both the son's name and property. Ruth's fierce covenant love for Naomi brought them back to Bethlehem, but it was Naomi's instruction of Ruth that led to a future for them both. How did this happen? Well, Ruth gets to know Boaz as she gleans in his field. And eventually, Boaz negotiates to become her redeemer. He marries Ruth, and he purchases her husband's property. They wed. They have a child. What we discover is Ruth's covenant loyalty to Naomi actually became a path to redemption, a way out of famine and their vulnerability to a great harvest. As I think about the generational transition that is beginning in many of our Korean churches, I imagine that what the laity and pastors together have to discern is, what is it about our way of doing things that can be left behind as the next generation is brought in? And what is it about our way of doing things that is so core to being Christian community, biblically and theologically, that it must be kept? These are not easy questions. I believe that the Korean American Church has brought great vitality to the Virginia Conference, and not solely because you brought us Bishop Cho as our bishop. What is interesting to me about the story of Ruth and Naomi, it is Naomi, who's the one who's familiar with Israelite culture, who becomes the guide for Ruth to navigate a future for them both, a future with hope. Now, this is in line with our usual way of thinking, that it is the older ones who should bring along and train the younger ones. But notice that what is important here is that Naomi is familiar with the culture, and Ruth needs to learn. Naomi actually immigrates twice. She first goes to Moab, and then she returns to her homeland. And as she returns to Bethlehem, to the house of bread, she is able to teach Ruth how to be fed, not just physically by gleaning, not just emotionally by marrying, but spiritually, because Ruth says, your God will be my God. Naomi teaches Ruth how to be fed by the Lord. She is a blessing to Ruth, and in return, Ruth blesses her with a son. The younger woman and the older woman mutually bless one another. In our context, it may well be that the next generation is the one who provides the expertise for how to be fed spiritually by the Lord, how to thrive in America for a church of Korean lineage. I love how my son Tim is himself learning Russian, so that both he and Lily will be able to have a stronger relationship with Alya's parents and grandparents. This learning the language is a sign to me of his fierce covenant loyalty to his wife and to her family. Increasingly, as churches in America, we have to learn the language of a new generation of people, many of whom have not been brought up in church, many of whom do not know Jesus. All of the churches in my district are struggling with how do we connect to the next generation so that they might know the love of God in Jesus Christ. What the story of Ruth and Naomi teaches us is that this challenge of evangelism is all about relationships. Relationships with God and relationships with new people who don't yet know the Lord. Now, when Ruth's baby is born, no one is more delighted than Grandma Naomi. Indeed, the women of the village say, "A son has been born to Naomi," not to Ruth, to Naomi. They named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now, David is the famous King David. And who is King David's most famous descendant? Jesus. And Jesus is our Redeemer. So out of Naomi's bitterness, out of all these losses and brokenness in her life, sweetness returns when Ruth bears a son. Even though her husband and her 2 sons have died, through Ruth's fierce covenant loyalty, Naomi gets a son. And the women, all of Naomi's friends, this is what they say to her: "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a next of kin. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, and who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him." And what is it that brings about this transformation from death to life for Naomi? A decision by Ruth to travel to an unknown country so that Naomi would not be alone. A new life that begins with these powerful words: "Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people. Your God, my God." Amen.